Alright, so welcome to the 16th and final video in this entire orchestration series. In our last video, we discussed writing for the piano, celeste, and harp, including important considerations that are often overlooked by beginning composers. In this video, we are going to wrap everything up with a nice, neat bow and discuss my own personal approach to orchestrating a new piece of music from start to finish. So with that, let's get started. The very first thing we need is something to orchestrate. So I wrote this piano piece yesterday, specifically for this video. Let's give it a quick listen. And there we go, so now we know what we're working with. Once you have your material prepped, it's time to actually start orchestrating it. The very first step is to get a general idea of what kind of sound you want to go with. What instruments do you want to include? Are you using the whole orchestra, just the string section? Just get a basic idea of what you're working with before you start getting more detailed. For example, in this piece, I know that I want to use the piano and the strings. I'll probably make use of at least one or two woodwind instruments as well, but I don't think that I'll have much need for the brass. Other than that, I'll keep it safe and say that I'll probably want a harp and some percussion in there somewhere as well. The nice thing about this step is that you can be really as detailed or as vague as you want. Nothing is written in stone yet, and you can always just switch things up later if you decide to. On to step number 2, dividing the piece into smaller, more manageable segments. Now, it's important to figure out where your music just naturally separates into different statements or sections. Basically, you're looking for any spots where you'll want to make some shifts in the orchestration. Now, this can mean something different to every person. If you're scoring for film, TV, or games, then what's happening on the screen can help inform part of this. If you're an experienced instrumentalist, then you can try and imagine where the rehearsal marks would land in your music. However, if you're ever in doubt about where to mark a new section in your music, you can always look for places where a large chunk of the same basic material is repeated, or for spots where new musical statements or ideas are introduced. This piece is pretty short, so I'm just going to mark each 4-bar phrase as its own section. Once we've got that taken care of, we can move on to the next step in the process, which is mapping out the compositional structure. So for this step, we want to look at each section of the music and break down the compositional structure in terms of what material is in the foreground, midground, and background. For each type of material, we'll also have additional questions to ask that can help clarify the plan for moving forward. This first section is pretty bare bones. It's just a melody and some arpeggios. The melody is the more important of the two, so I'm going to place it in the foreground. The arpeggios are a little more tricky. I'm thinking that I want to add some sustained chords to this part, probably in the string section. At least a very simple drone. So I'm going to put that in the background. The arpeggios have more movement to them, so they'll naturally demand more attention than the chords. So I'll place them in the midground. Now I'm going to repeat this process for each section of my music, keeping in mind that there doesn't always need to be a midground. When I'm done and I have a nice basic plan for each section, it's going to be time to get a bit more detailed. For each section, we're going to want to ask the following questions for the foreground, midground, and background. Number 1, what tone colors do I want? Number 2, how will I use pitch, dynamics, articulation, rhythm, and timbre, texture, and tone color to keep the material in its designated role? And then number 3, what instrument or instruments will be responsible for this material? Let's try answering these questions for the foreground of the first section. Number 1, what tone colors do I want? Well, keeping in mind that this is the start of a new piece, and that in general, I want to arrange this piece to have kind of an imaginative, almost nostalgic kind of feel to it. So I think I want to start it out with a very intimate and very quiet tone color at first. Number 2, how will I use P-Dart to keep the melody in the foreground? Well, regarding pitch, I'll just make sure that the melody remains in the highest register found in this section. Dynamic-wise, I'll just make sure that it's among the loudest material performed as well. I'm not going to do anything too dramatic for articulation, but the rhythm of the melody is syncopated while all of the accompanying material is not, so that's going to go a very long way towards keeping them separate. Other than that, I won't be doing anything too crazy with the texture or timbre, just making sure that not all of the material is using the same type. So finally, what instrument will be responsible for this? Well, personally, I kind of like the intimate feeling of the piano for this piece, so I'm just going to use it to represent the melody. Continuing with this idea, when I answered these questions for the midground and background, they helped me to come up with the idea of keeping the arpeggios in the piano as well, using primarily rhythm, pitch, and dynamics to keep it separate from the foreground, and just some real simple strings on the sustained chords in the background, using the entirety of P-Dart to keep it in the background. Now, you'll want to go through your entire piece, section by section, answering these questions. It can feel a little tedious at times, but it is very important. While you're doing this, it can be very helpful to try and keep a few basic ideas in the back of your head that can help inform the decisions that you're making. My 5 go-to quote-unquote rules that I like to hold myself to when orchestrating are 1, to frequently shift the voices performing the material. This can help keep repetitive ideas from growing dull, and can also help increase the energy and the tension in the music. Number 2 is that it can be helpful to pair these shifts in orchestration to other important shifts in the music so that they make logical sense. For example, important shifts in the harmony or in the rhythm, or when you start a new phrase, etc., etc. Number 3 is to consider using these shifts in orchestration as tools for strategic growth in your music. For example, doubling for growth at different moments. Number 4 is to make sure that every part you write is written for the appropriate strengths of the instruments you're writing it for. And then 5 is to keep a constant and steady balance between the foreground and the background material. So if, for example, I decrease the strength of my foreground, I want to make sure that I decrease the strength of my background as well to keep them nice and balanced. Whenever I'm writing out my orchestration map for the foreground, midground, and background material of each section, I try to keep these 5 principles in mind. Now, once you've gone through every section of your music and answered these questions for every layer of your music, you'll find that you've got a pretty detailed and hopefully very useful orchestration map to work with. The very next step is to revisit each section and consider possible uses of the percussion section. However, if I'm being honest, I only really follow this step about half the time. Personally, I like to add the percussion after everything else is already written, unless I have a few specific ideas of what I want to include in the map. But either way, you'll want to eventually, at some point, go through your piece and address each of the 7 traditional roles of the percussion section to see where it can contribute the most to your music. Once you've done all of this, you're finally ready to start writing out the actual music. Having the map will help make things go much more smoothly and quickly, but it will still likely take a significant amount of time to get things sounding just the way you want them to. While you're writing, make sure to keep in mind the needs of your players. Are the parts being written in an appropriate range for each instrument? Do your wind players have space to breathe, etc., etc.? Once you're done with your draft, the very last step is to go through all of it and double and triple check for any mistakes or issues that you may have missed. This can be a pretty daunting task, so I've prepared a helpful and standard list of issues that you can look for. First, start by going through each major section of the orchestra that you're working with: woodwinds, brass, percussion, piano, harp and keys, and strings. And make sure that everything is physically possible to perform. So if you're writing for a specific orchestra, have you stuck to the available instruments? Have you accounted for multi-instrumental players and their needs? Is everything within a possible range for the instrument? Is it possible to play the dynamics you've chosen in the range that you've written for them? And of course, is everything playable lip and breath-wise and string-wise? Once you've made sure that it's all possible to play, the next step is to make sure that it's well orchestrated. Start by looking at all the foreground material. Is it played in appropriate registers to keep the foreground? Are the dynamics appropriate to compete with the other material? Then look at the midground. Is it played in appropriate registers and dynamics for the various roles it plays? Is it differentiated from the foreground and background via P darts? And finally, review the background material. Is it played in appropriate registers or dynamics for the role? Is it differentiated from the foreground and background via P darts? Does it account for any movement or pitch that could possibly distract from the foreground? And are all the blended chords sticking to the two rules of blended chords? One being that every note is played in a register of similar power to the other instruments, and two, that you stick to just consonant intervals for any chord voicing within a subsection of instruments. Once you've double and triple checked everything, you're ready to call your music complete, or at least to take a break from it for a while. So let's give a quick listen to what I was able to put together with this piece by following the map we drew together. Not too shabby. So, just to summarize, step 1 to orchestrating. Come up with a general idea of what kind of sound you want to create. What instruments do you want to use? Be as specific or as vague as you want, although being detailed is going to be much more helpful. Step 2, divide the piece into smaller, more manageable segments. These can be anywhere you want, but the general idea is to just mark areas where you want to make a shift in your orchestration. Some decent starting points are any spots where you introduce new material or repeat previously introduced material. Step 3, map out the compositional structure. Go through the music section by section and decide what material is in the foreground, background, and midground, if there is one. Step 4, answer the 3 questions for each layer of each section. 1, what tone color are you going for? 2, how will you use P-Dart to keep the material in its designated role? And 3, what instrument or instruments will you use? For this step, it can be helpful to keep in mind a few guiding principles for your piece in general. These are my go-to guidelines. Step 5 is to revisit each section and consider the 7 traditional roles of the percussion section and how they can help support your music. Step 6 is to write out your music. keeping in mind what is actually possible for each instrument. And then step 7 is to double check it all. Try to make sure that it is both physically playable and well orchestrated. So with that, we've reached the end of this entire orchestration series. So thank you so very much for being so supportive and patient while I put these videos together. I hope that you were able to learn some useful information from me, and that you feel more confident with your own orchestrational skill set than when we first started this series. I cannot express enough gratitude for the many wonderful comments and emails that I have been receiving from you guys. Knowing that so many of you have been finding this channel helpful has, well, it's honestly kept me excited to keep putting out new content. And I still can't believe that this channel has grown so much in the past year. So I've been working diligently behind the scenes to get things ready for the next series, which is one that many of you have been actually requesting for quite some time now. So I'm super excited to share it. Please keep an eye out for a new video that I'll be uploading tomorrow that will have a lot more details on what you can expect. So with that, thank you again for your continued support. And in the meantime, as always, keep working hard, keep studying, and keep writing new music.